Every Christian has heard of the unforgivable sin, but Matthew 12 doesn't mean what you think it means. And if you're scared you've committed it, that fear is the actual proof you have it. You've been there. Maybe it was 2 a.m. Maybe it was in the middle of a sermon. A thought crossed your mind that made your stomach drop. Something dark. Something about God that you would never say out loud. But maybe you did say it out loud. Maybe you said it out of anger. Maybe you were in a spiral. And you didn't just think it, you meant it in the moment. And now you're convinced that your intention is what makes it unforgivable. Here's the problem. You read verse 31, but you didn't read verse 22. If you skip the context, you'll spend your whole life terrified of a sin that your own fear proves you didn't commit. In Matthew 12:22, a man was brought to Jesus. He was demon oppressed, blind and mute. Jesus healed him. The man spoke, he saw, and the crowd was amazed. They said, "Can this be the son of David?" But the Pharisees looked at the exact same miracle and said something that changed the entire conversation. It is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that this man cast out demons. They watched the Holy Spirit set a man free, and they called it the devil's work. That's the first thing everyone skips, the context. Jesus wasn't issuing a vague warning to anyone who's ever had a dark thought. He was defining the sin by what was happening right in front of him. But here's the second thing everyone skips, the first part of the verse. Matthew 12:31. Therefore I tell you, every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven people, but the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. Read that again. Every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven people. Jesus led with the widest promise of forgiveness in the entire gospel, and you skipped it. You built your entire fear around the exception because you skipped the rule. The rule is sin is forgiven. The exception is for those who look at the Spirit's work and deliberately call it the devil's over and over again. But here's what nobody talks about. The Pharisees were the most biblically literate people in the room, and that's exactly why they did it. They weren't confused or ignorant. They studied the prophecies. They knew Jesus came from God. Nicodemus said so in John 3. We know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. And then a man who was blind and mute walked away seeing and speaking, and they watched it with their own eyes, but they rejected what they knew. They didn't miss it. They saw it clearly, but they relabeled it. Not because they were confused about the source, but because admitting the source would cost them everything. If this was the Spirit of God, then Jesus was who he said he was. And if Jesus was who he said he was, then the Pharisees were wrong about salvation. Their authority, their system, their entire identity, all gone. So they didn't just reject the miracle, they called the rescue an attack. But why would anyone relabel a rescue? A building is on fire. A firefighter runs in and pulls the child out. Ash on his face, burns on his arms. The kid is alive in his hands. But standing on the sidewalk is the building inspector, the same inspector who signed off on the building and said it was safe. If the firefighter is the hero, then the inspector is the one who failed. So the inspector turns to the crowd and says, that's the arsonist. Not because he's confused or he has smoke in his eyes, but because admitting the rescue means admitting that the building should have never been called safe. And he's the one who called it safe. That's what the Pharisees did. They were the inspectors of Israel. They told people what was from God and what wasn't. And when the Spirit of God showed up and did something they couldn't explain away, they didn't recertify. They relabeled the firefighter as the arsonist to protect their authority. So what is the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit? It is not a bad thought. It is not doubt. It is not a season of wrestling with God. It's not even something you said out loud in a moment of anger or fear or spiritual panic. It is a deliberate positional decision to look at the Holy Spirit's work and call it satanic. Not because you're struggling, but because the truth threatens your authority. The Pharisees didn't have a bad day. They had a system to protect. Mark's gospel makes this even more clear. Mark 3:30 says, Jesus gave this warning for they were saying he has an unclean spirit. Mark told you exactly why Jesus said it. It was a diagnosis, not a threat. The person terrified of committing the unforgivable sin is the last person who could have committed it, because the people who actually did it weren't scared. They were certain. They weren't up at 2 a.m. searching for answers. They looked at God's work, called it the devil's, and went to lunch. So if that's not you, then something else is going on. And the real question isn't whether you committed it, it's why you can't stop believing that you did. Because someone benefits from that belief. Think about what happens to you when you believe that you've gone too far. You're sitting in church, the worship team is singing. Everyone around you has their hands up, and your hands are in your lap. Not because you don't want to worship, but because you think God doesn't want to hear from you. That's what the fear does. It doesn't make you leave the faith, it makes you stand in the room and feel disqualified. The enemy's strategy with the unforgivable sin was never getting you to commit it. It was getting you to believe you already did. The accusation does the same work as the sin, and you never even came close. If you believe you're beyond forgiveness, you stop asking for it. And a person who stops asking for forgiveness isn't someone God rejected. It's someone the enemy convinced to walk away. Remember the inspector on the sidewalk? He didn't just call the firefighter an arsonist. He wanted the crowd to stop trusting the rescue. That's the same play. The enemy doesn't need you to blaspheme the Holy Spirit. He just needs you to believe that you did so that you'll stop trusting the Spirit's work in your life. So here's the full picture. Before Jesus warned about the one sin, he led with a promise. Every sin and blasphemy will be forgiven people. That's not you wrestling with doubt at midnight. That's not you having an intrusive thought during worship. That's not you saying something terrible out loud because you were angry or scared or spiraling. You know how I know? Because you regret it. The Pharisees never did. Condemnation pushes you away from God. Conviction pulls you toward him. Which one are you feeling right now? Your fear is not evidence of guilt. It's evidence of a conscience that's still tender toward God. A heart that's blaspheming the Spirit doesn't grieve. It doesn't search, tremble, or lose sleep. It looks at God's rescue and calls it the enemy's work and feels fine about it. The fact that you're watching this and the anxiety you feel over this, the fact that you care at all, is the proof that the Spirit is still at work in you. Remember the firefighter? The child is safe. The building is still burning and the inspector is still talking. But look at the kid breathing. The rescue already happened. You were never beyond it. So the next time that fear shows up at 2 a.m. and tells you that you've crossed the line with God, look at the evidence. You're still here. You're still listening. You still desire God. That's not a sign of someone the Spirit abandoned. That's a sign of someone the Spirit is still holding on to. And if you've never given your life to Jesus, that's the Spirit calling you home.